Hello, and welcome to another session here with OpenText. My name is Don Jackson. I'm a Chief Technologist here at OpenText. I'm pleased to have with me today Mr. Chris Trimper. Chris, if you want to introduce yourself real quick.
Hi, my name is Chris Trimper. I am the Enterprise QA Automation Architect for Independent Health. I have 15, 18 plus years of test automation experience, and I've had the opportunity working with micro-focus tools, the OpenText tool set in the UFT and ADM family for many years. And I'm pretty excited to be here to talk about all of our API testing capabilities that have just added vast efficiencies to our processes over the years.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us today, Chris. So today we're going to be talking about the OpenText point of view around functional testing for APIs. As I said, Chris is here with Independent Health. Chris is going to be our subject matter expert on this session today, and I'll be leading us through the conversation. So the agenda for this session today is to talk about tenets of API testing, what we feel from a point of view perspective really is what's important from an API testing perspective. We'll talk about what it takes, what do you need to have before you start doing your API tests, before you start building them. And then we're going to see it live with OpenText, where Chris has volunteered to go ahead and let me dictate to him the test that we need to do, and then we'll summarize that. So before we get started on that, I think it's important to reiterate that everyone owns quality today. The days of tossing the app over the fence to QA are over. So from an API perspective, while API testing is a more technical test, so you're really probably not going to be able to get to the point where anybody can do an API test. You know, your business folk probably aren't going to be able to do API tests. We want to reduce the technical barrier to being able to do API tests and make it easier for more testers to be able to do it rather than test engineers or automation engineers. So let's talk about the tenets of API testing. So the first of which is the scope of your test should drive whether or not your test should be an API test or a GUI test. So in our example today, our test that we will do in the GUI is to test that the application allows us to delete an order. So that part of the test needs to actually be run through the GUI to make sure that the user has the ability to delete an order. All of the other steps that it takes to be able to do that should be done as API tests. API tests also need to be able to intermix with GUI tests. So that includes, in addition to the data and the results being able to be shared in between them, it also should be the skills. So you shouldn't have to have a separate person, a separate engineer, work on the API tests than is doing the GUI tests. And that's what we'll see today. Now, the test automation solution that you're utilizing, needs to reduce that technical knowledge need to write the API test, right? You don't have to be an expert in APIs or in SOAP or in REST or UDDI to be able to write an API test. You should have to have general knowledge around API testing and the tool at hand to be able to write that test. Your solution also should be able to be agnostic to the service type, whether you're talking about the four that are kind of out there in the market today of SOAP, REST, XML-rpc, and UDDI, or as the market evolves and we get some kind of new protocol out there for APIs that you would need to test, that solution would want to include that as well. And there's a good rule of thumb. So pre and post conditions of your tests, especially when you're talking about GUI tests, should all be API tests. The big advantage of doing an API test is that it can execute far faster than a GUI test because you don't have to wait on the UI. You don't have to wait on the UI to load. If there's client-side processing that happens, you're not dependent on potentially a smaller machine that's going to run these tests slower. So when we drill into API testing, what do you need to be able to be successful to write an API test? So the first thing is you have to have the service itself, whether that's the SOAP service, the REST, any other service. SOAP and REST obviously are the most common today. That's why we call those specifically out. You have to have that service available and it has to be there. You need to have the requirements or the contract or the WSDL or WADL or whatever other artifacts that define that service for you so that you can work against it. It'll greatly speed up your API test design if you've got that information. While you can interrogate the service itself to figure out that information, having that definition layer will definitely speed up the time that it takes you to define your test. You need to have the endpoint details. So, what server, what's the connection string, what port it's running on. You have to have that kind of information. You also need to have the authentication details. If you assuming that you have a service that's protected by authentication, you need to have that authentication detail to be able to connect to it. And the last big thing is that you need to have a general understanding of the business process itself that you're trying to create the test for and the data that's going to be going back and forth. So now let's see it live. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk us through first what the process is that Chris has volunteered to be our automation guinea pig today. And then we'll actually see it and we'll switch over to his screen and you can see him do that. So first off, we decided to use the trusty good old Flights application. We purposely picked this application because it's old, because it's an older technology. It does have services underneath it, but it's an older client-side, client-server application that you need to test. Everybody can handle, when you talk about doing web services, you think about a website or maybe a mobile application, but we want to show you that this can apply to your desktop applications as well. That's the reason we picked the Flights application. So our precondition, as we talked about, is we need to actually book a flight order. So we're going to do that with an API test. We're going to write that test to book the order through the APIs, which is a very fast test to execute. And then we're going to pass that order number to our GUI test. Then our GUI test, which is the actual test that we're executing now, is to test deletion of an order in our application. So the steps to do that, which we will use our artificial intelligence object definition capabilities on the desktop app, will be to log in. We'll search by the passenger name. We'll verify that the order number, which we got passed from the API test, exists inside the GUI. We'll select the order number. We'll click the trash can button. We'll then verify that the delete order confirmation window comes up, that it exists. Then we'll click that yes button to say, yes, go ahead and delete it. And then we'll verify inside the application that the order number is no longer being displayed. We then have a post condition for this test to verify that the order number no longer exists inside of the backend application as well. So just because it's no longer being displayed in the GUI does not necessarily mean that it completely propagated through the backend. So we have a post condition to make sure that it no longer exists in the backend as well. So with that, we're going to go ahead and switch over to Chris's screen, and Chris is going to walk us through creating the test. So the first test that Chris gets to create is the precondition portion of the test, which is booking a flight order via API. So Chris, I'm going to hand it over to you and you walk us through what you're going to do here.
Thanks, Don. And yeah, I like using the Flights app. I know it sounds silly because it's an old app, and everybody that knows, the various iterations of UFT think that it's just been around forever. And to your point, it is tried and true. But what else I like about it is if you have network considerations or firewalls or security things, it comes with UFT and it runs locally. So you're not having any obtrusive odd things getting in your way. So it's a really great training ground. So, this is the kind of thing that anyone can go and reproduce. So the first thing I'm going to do is fire up the Flights app. Again, when you install UFT, this is something that you'd have to say, I don't know if it says demo apps or samples, but there's an option in there that you'd have to include it. Now with Flights, we get a couple of different options. Don mentioned about, SOAP and REST and different components. And, certainly pick something that's either of interest to you or pick something that is a technology that you use in your organization. Um, we still use a lot of things with web services, so I'm going to work with SOAP, and I'll mention a couple reasons why I find it useful with at least the Flights app soon. So simply all I need to do to get started, just to have it, is I'm going to copy that WSDL path by clicking that item. Then we're going to go into UFT, and I'm going to say I need a new test, and we want to definitely make sure that that test is an API test. Right now I'm just going to work locally, so everything's just going to be on my C drive. Definitely put it in your repo, in your ALM, or wherever your tests go. So this was going to be what again,
Or
Don?
your Git repo,
Register,
book a flight order.
book a flight. We're going to create an API test that's called book a flight. It's going to open up our test. Now, if you're not used to the API test module or API testing, there's going to be some differences here. So let's take a brief moment on and let's just go over some of the things. So the toolbar is going to be a bit different. There's going to be a couple of new icons up there for folks. One specifically for WSDLs that go with your SOAP services. I don't work with .NET assemblies, but you could to pull them in and interact with them. You can add a REST service, and the rest of them are probably icons that you're used to, presuming you're in the UFT 2021-2022 versions. Off to the side, we have a toolbox that has a lot of great activities in here that you're going to see. Simple things from, you know, doing some math, working with dates, working with files, and other things. The way that a API test is structured is it's a test flow. If you're familiar with flow-based solutions, or where you have something that you might want to iterate over a flow or make a decision, it is very user-friendly from a graphical perspective. So I kind of like to dive in to that service where we can schedule a flight. So to get started, we come up to where we would work with a SOAP call. And we're going to have two options where you can either import from a file or a URL. So, your development team might hand you a WSDL file, or maybe you have one with a link. In our case, we have one with a link. So I'm going to paste it in. If you did have to have authentication to be able to have access to it, so if it's behind some kind of login mechanism, you can open up advanced settings and you can work with authentication there. In the case of flights, it's not authenticated. We're going to just simply attach to it. When I do that, my toolbox is now going to grow. So for a moment, I'm going to shrink down standard activities and look at what it gives us. So we have our flight service, which has different methods. Think of these as classes with functions, if you're familiar with that kind of organization, and the different methods, operations, or functions that we have access to. One that we wanted to do is to create a flight order. So I'm just going to double click on it, and it's going to insert it into my flow. If you want to control specifically where in your flow something goes, you can click and drag it around as well. It's a very WYSIWYG interface. The next thing that we need to do is we need to provide some data to it. Now, I know Don mentioned that we have endpoints to work with. In the case of a local service like this one, as we noticed, it's just going to be our local endpoint. We don't have to worry about data driving it. If you did, that would be in the main tab, the general tab, and it would be your endpoint address. Any of these parameters, they're basically all turned into parameters, are something you can data drive. So you could link it to a data source, or you could type it in, whatever you may need. The really neat thing about using API tests in UFT is a lot of things in other tools or other techniques, like in an IDE that you'd have to work with. You'd have to work with a lot of coded elements or textual elements. But something like this, where the different options are easily available to you, are super nice.
So this is
So,
talking about that reducing the technical barrier, not eliminating it, but reducing the technical barrier so that you don't have to do this from a scripted perspective.
oh, for sure, absolutely, it does. Again, like you mentioned, you kind of got to know your process. Like if you don't know what goes into a flight order, you don't really know what a flight is, this is going to be really difficult to work with. A neat thing about this particular service that I like is when we look at our input, we look at our flight order, we have certain things like class. I'm like, oh, what's a class? Well, what's pretty groovy here is there are predetermined values, sort of like, gosh, I don't want to say enumerated type because that's not what I want because that's too programmatic. But if there's, expected types of inputs that you would have there, like if it's, a
Well,
telephone
in this
number,
case,
there's
it's a
like
list
home
of
and mobile.
values.
Exactly. Thank you. I was what I was looking for. But it is a list. And because that's in the definition of the service, that's made available to you here in the dropdown. So maybe we want to make a first class flight. The customer name. Now for these, for the simple demonstration, I'm going to enter values in. You'd certainly want to use data, and you'd want to attach probably an Excel spreadsheet or some other kind of means to drive data into this. I think John Smith happens to be the user we're going to work with, so I'll just make it for that person. Departure date. If you notice, I don't know if you can tell the icon, but this is a date time. The other one's a string. So when it's something that is a particular data type, you get some helpers for that. So in this case, a date, we get a calendar that pops up. So maybe you just like, I just want it for tomorrow. Well, you don't have to worry about it. You just select it. It's pretty easy. What flight number? Well, gee, now we're at a point where like, well, I don't know what the flight numbers are. Well, let's take a quick pause on this and let's find a flight number. So we have another service called Get Flights. You can simply drag that sucker in and let's start getting a list of flights. Now, I personally don't want to have an enormous list of all the flights that are out there. So I would like to seed it with a departure and arrival city and a date because we just don't want this huge list. We want a manageable list of things to work with. So I'm going to say London sounds good, and to me, Paris sounds great. And again, we'd want it for tomorrow. Um, so that's awesome. And then we'd
And
get
this
back
goes to
some
the point
flights.
earlier about understanding your data and the business process flow.
Hmm. No, absolutely, absolutely, it does. I might have purposely made some of these mistakes, or I might have forgotten things. It's only for you to know. Um, so now we theoretically would get some stuff back, and you think to yourself, well, I want to run this, but I'm not ready yet. We can super simply just go into the second one. We can just disable the step. Easy peasy. So we can run our flights thing and see what's in there. And since it's an API, it should be kind of snap pretty quick. And it's going to get a list of flights. And it does. We're using the same standard reporting mechanism that you would expect out of UFT. So we go to get flights. If we want to see what the input looked like, we can kind of see it here. What's groovy is you don't have to worry about any of these XML elements. It's all form driven in the tool. And we can look back and, I'm just going to highlight here so we can see what a flight looks like. Here you are going to need to know just a little bit of interpretation of how to look at things. I can see that a flight, and there's an airline and a flight number. Now, here is knowing the business part. When booking a flight, I believe it's expecting the flight number and to what airline it belongs to. So we're going to make that now. So like I said, that requirement is needing to have the flight number and the airline, and that is the thing it's expecting. Normally I wouldn't do this, but I want to kind of show it from a flow perspective. I can use something called concatenate strings, and I'm going to tell it to get from the flights. So when we are in the flow, anywhere we are along the flow, when we select for a linking or link to a data source, you might think, oh, that's just a spreadsheet. Well, no, we also have any other calls output as an option to us. Well, it just so happens that get flights, the way this is defined, will give us the full structure. So we have get flights. Flights is an array. So here you do need to know maybe a little technical knowledge. So anytime you see an array, think of it as a collection of. So flights, this get flights will contain a multitude of flights. So I want to say, let's just get a flight. And like I said, it was the flight number. Now, this thing you might see come up when you have a collection. Do we want to loop through every one? No, I don't think I want to reserve a flight for every single flight that's available for that day, unless you do. But for this demo, I don't. So instead of having it loop through all of those, I'm going to say no. And then we're going to do the same thing for the suffix. Now I am going to cheat with one thing here. I don't know if it matters for sure, but I know that in the tool, it's flight number, a space, and then the airline. So I'm just going to come down to the expression, hit the space bar, and then grab the airline. Just click it in there and say OK. I think because we had already said do not loop through, it says, well, he said don't loop through, so don't loop through. So that's going to give us our flight number. Now we'll run this one more quick time. I'm all about iterative development of testing. We're going to run it through and make sure it does what we expected. So I'm expecting a flight number and an airline that is the flight that I want to book for. So I would come to my concatenate strings, where we can see what was brought in the two values, and it gave us this lovely flight number, which is what our business process defines.
And I think something interesting to note from a design perspective is that as you created those linkages, it actually on the flow, the test flow, drew that arrow for you to show you that there's now a linkage from that previous call to that string manipulation call that you have there.
Yeah. Actually, if you hover over it, it'll tell you what it is. So it's looking at um, the flight itself, and where it's going into is it's going into this prefix and suffix. For sure, yes. When you see in the results, you're not going to see where it came from. You're going to see the values that were passed through. But it does kind of give you that sense of flow and hierarchy in here as well. In fact, you're going to see that again in a moment. So I'm going to come back and re-enable this step. The ability to enable and disable steps while authoring a test is really great because you're like, oh, this isn't ready, it's not working right, I don't have it there. You don't want to see it fail and crash and do silly things. Simply just come and disable a step. Think of it like commenting out a step or a series of steps in a UI test. So where we left off, we were going to first class, have for John Smith, have it for tomorrow, and flight number. We're going to get that from our string concatenation. Say where it came from, say what it is. So the result of the string concatenation is what that is, bringing those two strings together. And how many tickets. Now notice something cool here. String, date, integer. Oh, maybe it didn't need that. I probably went overboard, but look, I taught you how to concatenate strings. And int. So we could just use the up arrow, or I can type it in there. Now we can run this. We're going to proof it, and let's see what happens. Okay, it says it ran successfully. This might have been a problem because of that said it was a number and I gave it not a number. But let's read it and see. Oh my. All right, simple. The value cannot be parsed as type blah blah blah, integer. Well, oops, see, didn't know my business requirement there. We can simply fix that. We don't need to get it from there. We can get our new value from here. This is how you know that this isn't totally scripted. Flight number. And again, I said no because I didn't want to create one for every single flight. If you do again, just say yes, and it'll just iterate over it. It's so darn easy.
So darn easy, even Don could do it.
If you
I didn't
want
want to
to.
rip off from that insurance company.
Nice. So now we see that we created a flight because I used the business rules that I didn't use before. Oops. But let's face it, if I'm going to make a mistake, making a mistake for an API test, you can see how fast that was to recover. Making that mistake in a UI test could take you hours to get to that point of making the mistake, and then you may have to script around it and go back and fix it. And anytime you're working with the UI, it's so much more costly in terms of time. That was what, a minute and a half to repair my oops. That was great. So if we look at the response, we can see the response is that we have an order number, a total price, and that seems to be what it gets. Now, if memory serves me correct, we said that we're going to want the order number out of this.
Correct.
So how do you get data in and out? I did not mention that. Let's take a peek at it. So in the flow, in your start, you have the ability to define inputs, meaning inputs that come into your test for the purpose of usage in your test, or outputs from your test. Again, I mentioned you can data drive this. For the sake of this demonstration, we're just going to have that hard-coded in there. Definitely don't hard-code things unless your test needs that one thing, like if this was testing first class and first class only, hard-code it. But consider data driving from either an Excel sheet or inputs. But we're going to look at the output. First thing we have to do is we have to define that output. So this was the order number. Was an order number. We can define it as a particular type. We know it's an integer, so we could do that. Do know that when you have it as a string, it would be just fine as well, either. I'll be honest, I usually just leave most things as strings. It depends on what is important to you. Is it something you need as a integer type or not? So we'll go to that create flight order, and let's look. We have, now a flight order makes one order. So in this case, we're not seeing the option of an array. We asked for a flight to be ordered, it orders it, and it orders one flight. So we're not going to see that the hierarchy, it's just going to be simple. So we want that order number. Order number comes in, no problem. We're going to test it one more time before we get in, but save and save often. So we'll save it first. We don't want to mess up the demo. And click run.
My son
Actually,
is taking a computer science class, and while I had told him for years save and save often, he didn't save one time, and he lost like 3 hours of work. He was very disappointed when his
so
app crashed.
So here's an interesting fun fact about this. So under the covers of UFT API, it's C#. It's a compiled language. You technically don't need to know this, but when you hit run, it compiles it and therefore saves it. So technically, an API test, when you run it, is saving for you. Theoretically, if during the compilation something goes south, you might lose something, but it is going to do that. But that's also important to know because every time you hit run, it should be doing a save. So just know that it's saving. Now, I'm just going to jump all the way to the end, and let's see. So we had a flight created. There we go. Now, we can do a lot of stuff in here. The scope of the test did not say to do this, but I'm just going to show it. You can add checkpoints. So if I wanted to, I could add a checkpoint for the order number, and I could just say, make sure that order number, let's say, is greater than 0. Maybe that's what I want in my test. Now, I don't want to change the scope of the test, so I'm not going to save that in there. But you can insert checkpoints in here that are validations if you so desire. If you have something where the WSDL or the contract or the definition of your service has a defined output, work like this. If you just demand total freeform and you want to just up to the next level or whatever, you do have the option to add an XPath checkpoint for XML services. Again, not going to do it, just mentioning it, it's there. So this is ready to go. We have our book a flight. Now the
So
next step,
now we've got our precondition of book a flight from the API test. Now we need to create a GUI test against the desktop application.
all right. Now, in case anybody's not aware, Flights comes with a desktop application, and here it is. So first thing we need to do is we need to make a test. Now, personally, I like having one or more tests open in my IDE together. So I'm going to go to my solution. I probably should save it, but to be honest, I'm not. I'm going to tell it that I want to add a new test to my solution, so I have both of those available to me. So the scope of this test is using the user interface, using the application. Therefore, I'm going to create a UI test. So this is flights. What did
Delete.
we say it was? Delete a flight.
Well, delete an order.
Delete a flight order. Delete an order. Perfecto. And we're going to create our UI test. You might say this is kind of flow-based, and it is sort of flow-based, but just not to the same type of degree as an API test. Now I'm just going to get right into the test. Depending on your desires, some people would want to use keyword view or scripted or recorded. It really doesn't matter, but for this case, we're going to go into what would be the expert view or the editor and work directly with the application. Now, since this is more around API testing, I'm just going to paste in some code that I have for launching the application. So we're just going to launch the flights application, and we're going to set the context of it. So I think, Don, you mentioned that we want to use AI interface for this. So that's going to allow us to use the artificial intelligence, computer vision driven interface to actually look at the user interface to interact with the application, as opposed to needing to know object IDs and working with object spy and stuff. This is going to be much more natural. So again, kind of reducing that technical barrier for authoring tests.
Yep.
All right, so there's our application. So we can do this a couple of different ways. We can use the inspection tool. We're going to tell it to inspect that application, where it's going to look at the screen, it's going to do some analysis on the screen and tell us what we have. Ultra fast, if you're not familiar with this, this is the way of giving computer vision or leveraging computer vision with the UFT tool to be able to interact with the application. So I have two different types of elements. I have visual elements, which are visual objects. So it sees things like this text box, and it sees it as username text box. Password, cancel button. This is probably a close. Yep. It sees help and a help, so it would be a help button. And if I click on any one of these things, it allows me to interact with it with different types of actions, type, click, verify, as its field. So I'm going to kind of walk through it and just use this as a method for generating my test. So we're going to, John is our user. I'm going to say type into that. I'll add it to the test. Maybe I'll even click run on application. And it's going to interact with it. And once it's done interacting, it should take me back to my editor. Oh, it's going to rescan, I forgot. And then I'm going to tell it to type the password in. Super secret password from ages of old.
That's how you know it's old. Is when you have a password of HP.
Yeah, it's okay. And then we're just going to go right in, because the test is not to test the login. The test is using the application for logins and mechanisms. So we're not going to do a lot of validations here. I'm going to click OK and say add the test and run it on the application. And you can see that it logged in. Wait for it to reinspect. I have noticed when, kind of a tip, when you're working with an application where the size of the application changes, it gets a little confused because it's still trying to look at that screen when it's this screen. So, sometimes you may have to tell it to select a different application, and that's just because, well, I'm not the R&D people, but I don't think it recognizes the app anymore. But it's as simple as, re-inspecting it. So we can see a lot of things here. Now, remember, what did we want to do? So we logged into the application, and we want to
Search
look for
for
our
a
order.
passenger by passenger name.
Yep, so we're going to click search order. It's simple as clicking it. We can even run it on the application. I promise when the application runs, I'll go like this so nobody thinks I'm clicking it. And we wanted to click search by the name, right?
Yes.
So the name, I think, was John Smith, hopefully.
Yep.
To the test. Run it on the application. This is kind of a feedback mechanism for me where it makes sure that what I'm about to put into my test works. And then search, click it, add it to the test, run on the application. In this case, we will data drive this, but I will have to click on an order number to go through this. So now in this case, I'll explain this super fast. This is a table, And tables are really interesting when it comes to things. You can work with it as a container, or personally, sometimes I like to work with it just as text because all of these are just textual elements. It's simple. So I'm just going to randomly pick order number 89, and then I'm going to edit the step. Now I'm going to go a step above here because you might think, well, what if, okay, 89 is not going to work much in most of these. Well, what if the number of flight is somewhere else on the screen? How do I know that it's that flight? Well, I could choose two different things. I'm going to go on the path that I know. It's the order belonging to John Smith. So I want to say that it's the 89 with a relation of John Smith. So there's a text block, John Smith, that's on the left. And that's the one I want to click on. So that's what I would drive it with. So I've added that in. We'll look at what that is like in a minute, and I'll tell it to run on the application. Now all that did was highlight it because the interaction with the application is click on it and then choose to select the order. So we'll do that. Now I'm going to switch back to a visual element because I want to click on the button. So this is the button with the verbiage select order. Add it to my test and run on the application. And I think the last thing we said is we want to delete it. Did we want to do any validation at this point, or are we kind of happy pathing our way through?
We're
Knowing
happy
that,
pathing until we hit the trash can button.
okay, sounds great. Speaking of trash can button, well, what's great is it visually recognizes that there is a trash can image. You might not know it's a button, but it's a trash can. See, it just knows it's trash. Not saying the application is trash, but the button is trash. We're having fun here, are we not?
Yes.
Um, so I'll say add it to the test. And again, we'll run it on the application. Now here's an area where this should be, I know we're talking about API testing, but we're also talking about efficiencies. This is something that everyone that works with things and pop-up modals should just be so excited about. I have a pop-up. It might be using a different technology. I don't really know how it's built. I didn't do this. But so many times pop-ups are so difficult to notice. Well, it's just capturing the screen. There it is. There's my notification. I could click on the, we won't get into why it thinks there's a space between Y and yes, or one of those buttons. In this case, I want to have the full text there because I think we want to make sure that either a notification is present or that it asks if we want to do it. So this is wonderful. I can click this. I don't want to click on it, but maybe I want to verify it. Verify it. Lovely. And then once we verify it, then we want to click on yes. Now in this case, here's a, we'll call it a, well, I'll call myself pro tip for the moment. When you're working with the AI engine computer vision, if you told the computer, tell me everything you see here, it might get some spacing and casing things wrong on occasion, just like a vision test would. So we know this button says yes. Maybe it thought there was a little bit of a space in there because of the way the E is rendered and kerning and things that we don't want to talk about. If you want to correct it, it's as simple as going, listen, I'm for the moment smarter than you, computer vision, so I'm just going to come in and click edit and get rid of that space. And then I'm going to say click it. I'll add it to my test. And again, we can have a proofing thing and hands off, and it should click on it just fine. Because truthfully, seeing those two is okay. I am intrigued if, well, if we can capture that. Does it stay for long? Yes, it does. So we could go as far as saying was, you know, the order deleted there and add it to the test. From there, Don, please keep me in scope. What is our next thing we want to do? Are we done with the app?
Yep. So our post condition there is to verify that the order number no longer exists via an API call.
Okay. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a new test. So I'm going to do it through the solution because I want it part of my solution. I'm going to say add. We're going to add a new test. And it is, again, an API test. Just say verify order not present. And add. Now, just to mix things up a little bit, this time we're going to use the Swagger. for the REST service just to, kind of give it a look-see. I can't be 100% sure, but I think that for the Flights app, the two services have almost the same feature set and operations and methods. So, it shouldn't really matter which you use, but let's take a peek at it. So I copied that Swagger link. So instead of going to working with a WSDL, I'm going to say working with a REST. Now, REST service has a lot of different types of definitions. A Swagger, I've honestly never worked with OData, but between a WADL and Swagger, those are two different definition types. So in this case, we had a Swagger, and I'm just going to paste in that link. Again, it's on my machine, and say OK. And we should see that we have a similar, collapse the standard activity so we can see it, see a similar type of layout. It is going to be a little different because this service is more RESTful, where you would have something like flights and then the flight number and then an operation or something like that. But what's really groovy is you don't have to know how to manipulate the URL and the pathing where you would have to with other utilities. Here we kind of just go in and it's very user intuitive. So we're not going to get a flight. We more wanted to work with orders, so that's in here. And the item that we want would be get orders. And just to kind of, again, prove out, there is a, flight order, an ability to, do a flight. Actually, I guess it was to reserve. But we're doing a order. Now we did need to data drive this, so we want to data drive it with an order number. So we're going to have an input parameter to our test for order number. And we're going to come to our order thing. I'm going to open up the properties a little bit more. And in this case, it is expecting order number to be an integer. Sometimes services are particular, so let's just be proper and let's change it so that our input is an integer so that it's all happy. That will mean likely, because integers typically have a default, if you didn't specify a value, that it would default to 0. So we want to drive that. Now you might think something wacky like, Chris, what in the world is that? Now this is something that you will see when you have a Swagger that you bring in that defines a REST service. If I look at a method and I look at, say, what were we looking at? Get orders. I'm going to see that there's probably some things somewhere along here. Not there. Yeah, so these things are data driven. So all of those the methods or functions or operations don't necessarily stand alone on their own like they do with a web service and a WSDL. There's going to be different things that they inherit from each other down the pathing. You don't have to worry about this because it takes care of it for you, but this is visually representing that there's things in there that are relating to each other. So, the originating URL and all the path throughout it. But again, you don't have to worry about that. So for us, we only want an order number. So I'm going to come to date and I'm going to clear it out and say, I don't want that there. I'm going to come to customer name. I'm going to clear it out because we only wanted the order number. And I'm going to link that order number to our order number that we got in. Now, we may not know what this looks like. So I want to run it and see what the behavior of it is. So we had order number, was it 89, I think?
Yes, 89.
So I'm going to hit run. You may think, Chris, you didn't tell it order 89. Well, you can give it input parameters. So when you say run, you can give it input parameters, and that's feeding that start. So I'll say 89. We're going to run it. And assuming I type things appropriately, we should just get this to run. And it's going to give us a result. But don't freak out about the error, because I have a theory. I know what it's doing. We can look at the test flow. We can see that it went through fine. And it does have an error. Now, the reason we have an error is because it has an order or a status code 500. Some of our services do this as well. If you're doing a search and nothing was found, sometimes instead of giving an OK, a server OK, it gives a server error. I am not by any means going to pretend to be a developer of services, so I don't know the justification for it, but I can say this is something that I see a lot. Now for us, this could be great because we could say, well, we expect it to give us a 500. That could be wonderful. Let's look and see what the rest of it looks like. So we go to the response body, and we can see the response body says there's no flights that match criteria. Well, maybe we want that too. So I'm just going to take that and copy it. We can look at the rest of it, and you will see some things that differ here versus, the web services. But, the request body, oh no, this didn't have a request body. This used parameters. So the parameters were customer name, order number, and date. I guess date defaults no matter what, but my guess is year one is known to be blank. So let's go back and let's work that test. So in here, we could do a couple of different things. We can do a condition. So we can add in flow control. And we could look at the status code. We also probably could add a checkpoint for status code. So in this case, we want to verify we said it was 500. We check for it there. Now I'm going to go for simplicity and just do the check there. But know that you can do conditional. So if you need to make a decision on it, you can. I am going to delete this, and we're going to run our test again with 9. Now, we still see a failure, but I think that's because in our call, expect server error. Yes, we do expect a server error. So sometimes, sorry, I clicked away. Sometimes you will either have to tell it you're expecting a server error, or other times there may be an option down here to say that the format matches the expected format. That's more for like a WSDL. So we can say expect a server error. So let's run this again and specifying this. If you don't want to keep specifying this each time, you can go in and set a default. It's really not a problem, but just use that. All right, so the reason we're getting a pass is because we said expect a server error. Now, checkpoints. We expected that the status code, meaning the response from the server, is code 500. This may seem more technical than you might want to have. So, you could do other things, and we'll real quick show it with the conditional if you don't want to work with status codes. We could add a conditional. We could say if now in our case, this Swagger document did not have the definition of the output. I would consider a slightly more advanced thing to define the output. I want to extend this demo more than it needs to. So you can just say, response body as just as a string. So I'll just give you like the raw response. So a string, and you could say if it contains, and I still have that in the clipboard, there are no flights that match your criteria. So if it's that, you can do things. In this case, I'm just going to say, what, I don't like this as condition 8. So I'm going to go to the properties. I'm going to rename it. Check for no flights. If there are no flights, then we are going to tell it pass. No flights found. We could also put another message in here. This is kind of like your report event that's in UI test, so it's the same kind of thing. if they're, all right, so admittedly, this might be confusing. I said check for no flights. If no flights, that means yes. Sorry, I did that kind of backwards there. And we're going to run it, and we should get hopefully 2 passes. Remember what I said about having a default value?
Yes, I do.
Well, we're going to put a default value in there because you know what I did? I just clicked run. I didn't go over and set my value. So I remember not setting the value. It might avoid some headaches if you do something like that, because troubleshooting that, like, wait, it was working just fine. Now isn't it working? Yeah, whoops. But if you're ever intrigued, you can look at your raw request or your request body. In this case, for this REST call, there is no request body. There's nothing that it's sending. It is all through parameters. A lot of REST things will be through parameters, especially for when you're requesting details. When you're submitting details, it might be different. But again, the WYSIWYG is going to take you through it. It's fine. And in our case, the response had the message that we expected. Scroll all the way down. We have a checkpoint. We got a server 500. Check for flights is there. So in which case we said pass, flight was found. Now, I could go out on a whim and test it with other flight numbers we know exist, but I think we'd like to try to wrap this up. So let's take this and let's say that we want to use the checkpoints that are in this. Remember, an API test can be for pre-stuff, but it can also be for validation. This is not only going to be one that runs a series of things through an API, but it's also going to be self-validating. And I think that's a good idea to do. Could you instead set this up so that you say yes or no here and then you do your validation in the UI? Sure, but I called this verify order not present. That means it should be doing some kind of validation, and I want that validation in here. So we can go back to our solution, and we can find our delete an order, which kind of pulls it all together. This would be our more end-to-end. So I can come into this, click it, and just dive into the action. After we close our thing, we still have our order number here, so we can still data drive. So I'm going to go to design, call an existing API test. Sometimes it'll show up in the list, but you can always just navigate for it. And ours was called verify order not present. Again, I want to have it be a relative path. So if I ever take these tests, move them somewhere else, like into a repository, as long as they're in the same hierarchy tree, it'll be fine. Now I can drive this for whatever I want. I'm going to cheat and just call it X for a minute because I don't remember the exact verbiage that I had. So we can change that when it gets into our test. And I'll just replace this X with sending in my order number. I'm going to do quick save. And then we can actually run this end to end. Remember, the end to end of it is we're going to create an order with an API. So that in the UI, we have the ability to delete it and verify its deletion from the UI. But then we're like, you know what, we need to make sure that the backend system doesn't have the order. So this is going to be that test. So hit save. Flights isn't open. Do keep your Flights API open. If you close this, I do believe it shuts down the APIs and your test will fail. So I'm going to tell it to run. I have no parameters for this because I am running the Flights app, not the rest. I'm going to say go. I'm going to sit back, hands are up in the air, not doing anything, not touching the keyboard.
Look, Ma, no hands.
Exactly. So given the order that created with API, it should be coming through here and looking for that flight. Yeah, sorry, I'm on a VM and it's probably got minimal resources, so that's what you get with my test box. So again, we're finishing up the UI test to make sure that it is no longer present from a user experience perspective. But then for due diligence, or because the requirements told us to, we are going to want to go through and make sure that the order is not in the system.
So that could be, for example, a hard delete versus soft delete type of test that you do, right? So if the requirements was that it does a soft delete, you could do the opposite and make sure that it is still present in the backend, but it's not showing in the UI.
Yep, and let's be very honest. What happens in the user experience may or may not truly reflect the system. It might have sent off a message and said, I sent the message, I'm done. But it's entirely possible that it sent the message, but it sent the wrong message, or the message wasn't received, or the server. Again, we're talking more end-to-end multiple systems, not an isolated system test. So for sure, that's cool. Now here we have, we'll really quickly run through this. This is the full results. We can see there were either 21 things done and or validations. When you have an API test, it will show up as a run test and external call out, where if you want to view it, I'm control clicking to get it into a new tab to see that if you wanted to, but you should be able to see it in usage. It's going to go through interact. In this case, it was typing into a field. We did indeed search for our order. We verified that it was deleted, order 92. We verified that it is not there. So when we said check for it, it's not going to show up on here, hopefully, because we said we don't want it there. So we want to make sure it's false, and it was indeed false. And we closed, and then we ran another API test. We will look at this one because this one is new to us. We open up that other report. When we started off, we sent in order 92. We told it to, where's this one? We told it sorry, it's a little small, but does order 92 exist is what we asked, the API, and it told us order 92 does not exist. No orders are present. That was present both in a server 500, because that's the behavior of this particular service, as well as we interrogated the response to say, is it there? In which case we said there were no flights found. So this now is an end-to-end that, Don, if you can go back to our slide that we went through, and we had the pre-step of creating an order so that we are seeding our test in the most efficient way that we know how to through a service, so that when we get into the test, we are setting ourselves up for success for that test. The scope of the test is, I have an order, I need to delete it. Well, set yourself up for success with a service and provide yourself an order that is yours. Don't rely on an order that somebody else is going to steal from you. Set yourself up for success. Run through it all, and then our post condition to say, I need to really make sure that that's no longer in the system. Leverage an API for that as well. And, for fun's sake, we used the WSDL for a SOAP call for the pre, and the REST, the Swagger, for the post.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time today, Chris, to show us this and being our subject matter expert. So just to recap what we were talking about from an API test automation with UFT1. As Chris showed doing SOAP, Simple Object Access Protocol, with a WSDL. He also showed us REST, so representational state transfer. You could also do XML-rpc or UDDI, depending on what you need. Obviously, SOAP and REST are the much more prevalent in the industry. All of that within UFT1, where you can also merge those API tests with your GUI tests that could be AI-driven, as we saw in the example today, doing AI-driven GUI test automation with a desktop application. We've shown lots of videos where we've shown mobile, we've shown web, but this was showing it with a desktop application as well. So with that, I want to thank you guys all for taking the time today to watch this episode. I hope you found it useful to watch this video. And we have a QR code here that will send you to the UFT homepage so that you can get more information if you need more information. And I want to thank Chris again for taking the time today and being our subject matter expert. If you need to get in touch with me, my name is Don Jackson. I'm with OpenText. That's djackson3@opentext.com. And if you need to get in touch with Chris, you can reach out to me and I can pass along your information to him. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.